Hello and welcome to Ditching Hourly. I'm Jonathan Stark, and today I am joined by the OG podcaster himself, Paul Boag. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hello. OG. Again, instantly, I'm now out of my depth. OG is not a phrase that I'm familiar with. What does OG mean?
Original gangster.
Oh, that's far too other side of the pond for me.
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, so for folks who don't know, Paul and Marcus Lillington started a podcast in what year?
2005.
So that's crazy. So that was the first podcast I ever listened to. It's not the first one I ever heard of. I had heard of a couple of other ones that were sort of like husband and wife, talking about husband and wife stuff that like. But somehow I got turned on to Boag World. I don't even know where I would have heard of it because back then podcasting, it was still like iPod era podcasting. It was before the iPhone.
Did you happen to get .NET magazine or whatever? It was called something else back then. There was a web design magazine. They put us on the cover. They had in the days where you had CD-ROMs on the covers of magazines, and so we were on there for a while, and I think we picked up quite a lot of listeners that way. But it was amazing. There were no other web design or digital related podcasts. That just blew my mind. The fact that there was a podcast on knitting. Yeah. But not on web design just felt really offensive, so I had to do something about it.
Yeah, and boy, did you. I mean, that was like, I mentioned Boag World, and I got a bunch of email back, like, that was the first podcast I fell in love with or whatever. I remember the intro. You guys changed your intro from time to time, but there was one where you captured a guest who, there's a snippet of a guest saying, I feel like I'm on Letterman. And it was... It was like that. It was like the big show for web people, and so
well, it was part of that era, wasn't there? There was a period of time when the web felt very rock and roll, didn't it? Or we like to think that we were rock and roll before it all became commercialized, man. And because there was such limited choice. You know, it became quite big quite quickly. I mean, these days it would be impossible to build a web design podcast at that kind of scale simply because there are so many of them there. It's a bit like in the UK, you know, for my entire childhood, there were 3 TV channels and that was it. So, you know, viewer numbers on any particular program were enormous because, you know, people didn't have any choice.
Right. Yeah, same here. Well, so today I just kind of want to catch up, really, but also to kind of get your. I mean, it seems like every year is like this is the year that podcasting really hits the mainstream, but it does keep growing like crazy. And I still think, even though it's much more saturated than it was in 2005, that businesses especially, can get an enormous amount of benefit out of being in somebody's earbuds every week for an hour. So. What was your experience with it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, here in the UK, it has hit the mainstream, right? And the reason that I say that with such utter confidence is because 2 weeks ago, I went to see a podcast live. There's a husband and wife couple that do a comedy podcast called Shagged, Married, Annoyed. Which is enormous here in the UK, to the point where I went to see them in the O2 Arena, which is the biggest venue in the UK, 20,000 people in the venue, all because of a podcaster. So it can have enormous reach. But, I mean, let's be realistic. Most of us are not going to be that. You know, I was excited at the height of ours when we filled, you know, I don't know, a couple of thousand people in a venue. So, you know, it's not going to get to that extreme. But, and this is for me why podcasting has always had an enormous appeal, is because it creates what has become known as an asynchronous relationship, which is a very fancy way of saying that people get to know you as a person. You know, you know, you can write all you want. You can, you know, write a book. I've written 6 odd books. I've been blogging since 2005. But when people listen to you, they feel they know you. They feel that there's a relationship with you. And of course, if you're involved in any kind of sales activity, you know that the number one thing that sells is relationship, is trust, and trust is built out of a relationship and a respect for somebody. And so, you know, I built my career basically on that principle, that people know and respect me because they've listened to me and they feel that I'm their friend. I mean, I've had random people come up to me, you know, on the underground in London, saying, "Are you Paul?" And then they start chatting about aspects of my life, and I'm like, "How the hell do you know that?" You know?
Yeah. Same here. People will say like, someone will say something about like one of my kids or something. It's like, whoa, what did I say? You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it happens all the time when well, I shouldn't say all the time, but it is not uncommon for someone to be like, it usually doesn't happen in person these days, but I'll get email or something that I saw you on this podcast, or I listened to your podcast, or whatever. That's the thing. I don't really track the numbers, but just anecdotally, when people end up buying something from me, and I usually have a question like, "Oh, do you remember where you heard of me?" And it's almost always like some kind of podcast, either YouTube or a podcast. And yeah, so I try and get people to, I mean, I teach people how to start their own podcast. It doesn't, in my humble opinion, it doesn't need to be hard. It can be very complicated, but I think for it to be effective and to get started, you know, the best way to have a great podcast is to start a crappy one and make it better over time.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And one of my biggest shames is that my entire back catalogue of podcasts are still all available online. You can go back to number 1, and it is the most painful thing you have ever heard.
Yeah, everybody says the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same with everything, isn't it? I mean, you know, you've got to do to get better. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that. They think, oh, I'm not good enough to start podcasting. Well, you're never going to get good enough unless you start doing it. And the huge reassuring thing is you can start a podcast tomorrow and probably do 100 episodes and be pretty confident no one is ever going to listen to them, because it takes a long time to build an audience, you know? And I think that's what puts a lot of people off of podcasting, or indeed any form of content marketing, you know, whether it be blogging, whether it be YouTube videos. It doesn't happen overnight. It's the consistency that makes it work. It's you becoming a part of people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's switching your mentality from a hunter mentality to a gardening mentality. And like hunters want to run out and with their spear and like boom, come back with a buffalo. And to convince them to switch to gardening, which isn't going to produce results for 6 months at the earliest. They're like, oh, well, I could have had 5 buffaloes in the meantime, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, when are these tomatoes going to come out of the ground? I'm hungry now, you know?
Yeah.
So it can be a tough, I get it. I understand why it would be like that. And my start podcasting, heavily inspired by how much fun I had listening to your show and even eventually coming on your show. I started just a dopey podcast with one of my good friends, and we would just kind of banter and like try and make each other laugh, you know, sound familiar? And we just talked about nerdy stuff that happened at work that was, you know, I mean, we'd do shows about APIs or like a bug in Rails or something like that. And it was just like I almost said nobody listened, but actually people did listen. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where they came from. I don't, you know, maybe we must have tweeted about it or something. But it was, you know, if same thing, if you go back, that was my first show. And I think that was 2013 or 2011, maybe. And if you go back and listen to it, it's painful, like you said. It's just like, and the only way you get comfortable doing it, it's practice. You're not gonna learn how to podcast by reading a book any more than you're gonna learn how to ride a bike playing a book or play guitar. Like it's a practice thing. So you might as well get started. Probably no one's gonna listen anyway. And the other thing tell me if this happened to you. There's this other benefit to it that is much more immediate, which is that you've got something to invite people to. So you can, if you have this podcast and you do an interview style show, then you can reach out to people who would never otherwise spend an hour letting you pick their brain and say, hey, Seth Godin, could you come on and be the guest on our 100th episode? And they might say yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they did. I mean, I was gobsmacked at the people. You know, I remember interviewing, although admittedly they weren't well known then, but in my first year podcasting, I interviewed the two founders of Twitter. And actually, the really bizarre thing is back then, they really wanted to be on the show because they were trying to promote this new thing called Twitter. It was really funny in hindsight. So, yeah, I mean, and I've spoken to all kinds of people that I would never have got a look into otherwise. But I think there's almost another aspect of that, which is I became an expert via association. Oh, well, if so-and-so, you know, Seth Godin, for example, not that he ever did come on my podcast. I don't think I even knew he existed for a long time. I'm a bit slow on the uptake there. But he, you know, if he'd come on the podcast and I interview him, people start going, oh, well, Paul must be on the same level as Seth Godin. You know, there's this kind of expertise via association, which is incredibly deceptive because, you know, I had some brilliant people on the show and, you know, who were far cleverer than I've ever been. But yeah, it's the way the world works.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, you know, do you... I kind of expect the answer to this to be no, but maybe I'll be surprised. But I'm going to ask anyway. So, did you ever track Did you ever track okay? So, well, let me back up a little bit. You guys had like a firm or an agency. There's a number of people, employees. I imagine that at some point the podcast took up a non-trivial amount of time, and then you'd need to justify to yourself or perhaps partners that it was worth continuing. Did you did you track downloads and say, or this number of dollars from clients came directly from the podcast because that's where they heard of us? Or did you just kind of trust that this was a smart thing to do? Or was it a labor of love? What kept you going at the point? Yeah. Well, I'm assuming it got difficult at some point, but if it didn't, then it didn't. But what kept you going, for as long as you did?
Okay, there's a couple of kind of issues there. There's the one of tracking and justifying it. And no, I didn't really do that much. We knew, we didn't need numbers to tell us that. It was fairly obvious that the majority of new clients were either coming by referrals, which, is the lifeblood of any business anyway, or alternatively coming via the podcast. It was, or the podcast and the blog combined, because the two went very hand in hand. And I was incredibly supported by the two other co-founders of Headscape, Marcus being one, but there's another guy called Chris, and they just let me get on with it, basically. Sales and marketing became my primary role when I was running that agency. That's pretty much all I did. I turned up at the beginning of projects, looked impressive, spouted a load of BS, and then went away. So we could kind of see that. The other aspect is what kept us going. And to be honest, I think that was primarily down to we liked doing it most of the time. It did become hard work. And it, especially with interviews and setting up things like this, you have to put some thought into it beforehand. This was before the days of Calendly, where you could just go in and book something. So there was lots of backwards and forwards about calendars, and there was a lot of admin involved in it, which was a bit of a pain in the arse. But me and Marcus genuinely liked sitting down and talking crap for a couple of hours every week. And that was fun. We changed it up when we did begin to get weary. So we went from weekly to doing seasons with the break in between each season, which helped a little bit. There was, and to some degree, it's just stubbornness. I'm one of those people. I somewhere very early on in the whole thing, I think it comes down to my favorite quote. My favorite quote is by a guy, like you're not going to know him. Is from Winston Churchill. So you might never have heard of him. He's quite an obscure leader over here. Yeah, so Winston Churchill famously said, success is going from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm.
Oh, that's such a good one. Yeah.
Right. And that's how I live my life. So, I am very tenacious. And, I'm not somebody that goes, this isn't working, let's give up on it. It takes almost to my detriment. I podcasted. I've stopped podcasting now. I stopped in March last 2020. And it took. I went on way longer than I should have. I should have stopped before that, really. But,
yeah, just feeling like you're repeating yourself, or you just didn't. Yeah. You're like, this is. Yeah, done.
Partly that, and partly it wasn't. About 6-7 years ago, I stepped back from Headscape. And I now work as an independent UX consultant, and when you do that kind of work by yourself, you've got to be very regimented about getting a return on your investment from your marketing activities, because any hours, I don't know, this is going to get into dodgy ground, but any hours you spend, doing marketing is hours you're not billing. Sorry, we don't bill by the hours on this podcast. Sorry about that. But yeah, so you can see how in that scenario, you've got to make sure that the time you spend on marketing is not time that you're spending, is time being well spent. And the podcast wasn't performing as well as other things that I do. For me now, the huge benefit is, or the huge success area is email marketing, newsletters, which I know you do as well. And that is far more successful because of the overload of information out there. I mean, who goes and looks at a blog these days? You remember when we used to have RSS readers and we all used to subscribe to our favorite blog? I mean, nobody does that anymore. You search on stuff. Podcasts, a lot of people still subscribe to. But again, I'd just done it to death. I needed to do something different, after, 16 years of podcasting?
Yeah. I do both. I think it's a good strategy to do both, and yes, part of billing by the hours that you start thinking every hour you're not billing needs to be justified somehow. It's like, oh yeah, I know I'm on vacation with my family, but I could have billed like $10,000. It encourages that kind of thinking because your time is so connected to your. But let's see. At what point did you start with email marketing? How far back does that go? Were you doing that from the beginning of the podcast? I don't remember that.
No, that came in. I don't know actually when I started, but I've only got serious about it probably in the last couple of years. I've had an email list for ages. It's one of those things that you just randomly pick up somewhere along the line. Somehow, I don't know when. Yeah. But no, I probably only got serious about growing it a couple of years ago. And so now that's much more my focus. But my emails are they're still kind of a podcast in a weird way. That every email I produce is also a video version. So you can watch the email, because we all get so much email in our inbox. Right. If you can mix it up a little bit, then great. And so I just record pretty much to camera, me not reading, because I kind of wander off as I do, but essentially covering very similar content to is in the email, just to give people an alternative way of consuming it. And that also then gets released as an audio version. So there is I still am kind of podcasting, but really it's reusing the same content in 3 different ways. And again, that comes back to needing to be efficient in the way that I work. So I'll take the same piece of content and I'll reuse it across different platforms so that different people who like to consume things in different ways can all get the same stuff.
Well, Gary V would approve. So what's your workflow like there? Is it the video first, or is it the writing first, or do you just have is it like a transcript of the video, or is it more like you write a thing and then you kind of riff on it into the camera?
I write it first. I do have a teleprompter. I say teleprompter. That sounds so... Yeah. I basically have a thing that sits on the front of my camera and has got my phone on it, you know? A real cheap, nasty little piece of kit, but it does the job. So I've got it coming up. Sometimes I'm basically just reading it, obviously in a very enthusiastic and engaging way, but I'm basically reading it. Other times I lose the plot halfway through and go off on something. It kind of depends. So write it first, then record the video, so that when someone gets the email through, it says click here to watch the video, and it goes off to basically a blog post. So it's also, you don't have to be subscribed to get the content of my newsletter, although most people do. And then also that I just rip the audio out of that and shove it on a podcast as well.
And how much? No editing, just like, here we go, rough and ready. Yeah, that's...
a little bit. There is a little bit of editing. Sometimes I screw up partway through and I can't be bothered to re-record the whole thing. So, you know, my wife does does the editing these days. It's very, very sophisticated setup we've got. So she tends to hack me around and spends most of her time pausing me on stupid faces and then calling me over and say, look what you look like.
True love. So I love that. I love this. One of my big themes is to not be so precious about the content marketing stuff, whether it's an email or podcast, which are my two favorite channels, and just start doing it. There's like 80% of the stuff that makes a podcast hard, you don't have to do. Same thing with a newsletter. It's like, just don't do it. Don't have ads. Don't even have guests if that's a pain. Have a co-host or just talk by yourself. And because of all the back and forth, even with Calendly, people cancel and reschedule and stuff. And just get it out there. No music. I mean, if you don't need to have music. You don't need to have all these things that you hear. What the important thing is that you're helping the listener. And no one has ever complained to me that I don't have intro music at the beginning of this podcast. You know, no one cares. So, you know, is it a branding opportunity? And is it nice when you listen to a podcast that has a really cool song at the beginning? Yeah, it's nice, but it's not going to make or break your show. No. And it adds a lot of friction. So for people getting started, I'm like, keep it simple, make sure your sound is listenable, right? Like, like you might sound like an idiot, but as long as the audio quality is good and it's not like, you know, like things going on, because people will not put up with that. No. But right. So a decent mic, maybe not your headphone mic, but like, you know, a decent mic, maybe $50. It doesn't matter. There's tons of them. Just plug it into your computer and go for it. And I love so getting to the sort of not frictionless, but the leverage piece is that you're reusing the content in 3 different ways. I would say you still have a podcast. I mean, technically, you don't feel like you're podcasting compared to what it was like before. But if it's published as an RSS feed that can be consumed in a podcast, then I would say, you're kind of. But in your mind, you're not podcasting, which I understand. So I love that. I have a couple of students who are super, super natural, like live streaming on YouTube. They're like, they grew up with it. They're much more comfortable with that. And they have this video first workflow where they get a question from someone, or they find a question on Quora or Reddit or something. And they'll just like, hey, I saw this question online and it's blah, 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 blah. And it's, you know, it's right in their area of expertise. And so then they just kind of riff on it for 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And then that's the first thing. And then they take a transcript and they'll email it out and they rip the audio off too. And it's just like, you know, it's really quick. It's really quick. If you get into the habit of not editing, you know, telling the listener, you know this, but if you get into the habit of not editing and sending out your flubs and being embarrassed by them, you'll get better at not making flubs or covering them up or making them funny or you'll say less if you're not editing them all out every time. In fact, manually editing. I mean,
there's another factor in that as well, which is that it's those things that make you human. It's those things that build the rapport with the audience. I remember very vividly, very early on. Well, not very early on, but we hadn't quite reached the height of our subscriber base, but we were on the way up. There was a lot of people talking about us. And I decided one show to kind of go through the WCAG, the accessibility guidelines. And I was going through this list, and we hit one. I can't even remember what one it was, but because I was trying to think ahead and I was doing too many things, I completely misread what it was about and went off on this huge tangent about something. And we just published it, right? Didn't think twice about it. The amount of online abuse that I got.
Especially about that.
Of all things.
Sensitive topic.
But it was interesting because of the style of the podcast, because people got to know me. It wasn't horrible abuse. It was taking the Michael of me. It was, and so, but leaving that in, it humanized me. It made me fun. It became a standing joke. And did it undermine my credibility? Probably, in certain people's eyes. But there's enough people out there that actually found it endearing and fun that it wasn't a problem. I think a lot of people are afraid of humor as well. And messing around and being seen as being unprofessional. But I always come back. My great example of that was the first ever tweet from the CIA, right? If there's ever an organization that you would say shouldn't use humor, it would be the CIA, right?
Indeed.
But their first ever tweet is, "We can neither confirm nor deny that this is our Twitter account." And I just thought, that's great. If they could joke, then anyone could joke,
Yes.
Maybe not if you're a funeral home. That might be a step too far.
Perhaps.
But yeah, and I think that's a really... sorry, I've just completely derailed what you were saying.
No,
you were making a really
good
good point, and I've just gone off on one. But that's the other thing, is that I think a lot of people try and be something they're not on a podcast. Mm-hmm. So... there may be... You mentioned Gary Vee earlier, right? Mm-hmm. He's incredibly... kind of charismatic and outgoing, and you might think, oh, I've got to be like that. No, you don't. You've got to be you, because a lot of people really don't like Gary Vee. He's annoying. He's over the top. It's false, and I don't feel like that personally, but I know a lot of people do.
Right.
So you appeal to the people that like your kind of character. You don't need to put on a persona, and so many people feel like they do when they present themselves to the world. If you're a considered quiet person, be considered and quiet. If you're someone that doesn't like speaking publicly on something like a podcast, then write a blog post instead,
Yeah. In fact, if you listen back to early episodes of somebody's first podcast, a lot of times the reason it's cringy is because they're being a little bit professional or fake, or they're trying to, they're not being themselves. They're not being natural. It's almost like they're getting speaker's block. So, because they're trying to be something they're not. Like if you listen back to the first, people listening will be familiar with another show I do called The Business of Authority. And if you go back, Rochelle, I have a co-host on that show, and she cannot stand listening to like the first 15 episodes because it was the first time she ever did a podcast. In her head, it was a big deal, and she was nervous and trying to be very corporate. And she's like, I didn't think it wasn't that bad, but to her, she's just like, oh, can we redo those? It's not that bad, but in her, she can hear herself being fake, and she just can't stand it. It's like, that's the thing. And that's why you need practice to get through it. I mean, I was a musician. I've been standing in front of a mic since I was 15. So, speaker, musician, podcaster, whatever. And, it didn't automatically, like the first time I heard my recorded voice on a cassette recorder, when that was a thing, it sounded weird to me. Yeah. But after a while, you get used to it. It just sounds like you. It doesn't sound weird to anybody else. Yeah, it's like,
I mean, to be honest, I just don't listen to my own podcasts. That solves the problem for me.
There you go.
I don't listen to me speaking. I don't listen to me interviewed elsewhere. I can't stand it. And so, fortunately, Marcus always used to edit our podcast, so I never had to listen to myself again. So I would be horrified, no doubt, by what I say and do. But there you go.
Somehow it worked, right?
Yeah.
Well, so what's your direction these days? So you step back from Headscape. For the past, you said you air quotes stopped podcasting a couple of years ago, and we're doing more of the newsletter. What's the newsletter about? Have you changed direction overall? You said you're UX consultant, but what's going on in that space?
I mean, the newsletter came out of the fact that people's behavior has changed online. As I said earlier, but who people don't subscribe to blog posts anymore. They search if they've got a problem. Mm-hmm. But there are many topics of conversation in my mind that don't fit that format, right? So, you don't, for example, you never Google something like my last email that went out. You never would Google the subject, why is UX consultancy so messy, right? Which is what I wrote about, okay? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of opinion pieces and those bigger issue stuff, they're not the kind of thing that you would search on, but they're really important that they're discussed and talked about. And, I'm writing another piece at the moment about, organizing projects. Now, you might Google, how do projects work or how to run a project, but you're not necessarily going to, the thrust of the article is things like estimating time it's going to take to do stuff and how terrible that is. And so not all of these kind of translate well into searchable SEO friendly content. Mm-hmm. So that's what led me then onto doing emails where, people are subscribing and I'm building a relationship with them, and then they're interested in these broader issues still around, user experience design and conversion rate optimization and digital transformation, which are the three areas that I work in. Mm-hmm. But are a little bit more of opinion pieces. There's too many people out there already teaching you, how to start a podcast or how to, format something in CSS, Yeah. I don't want to get into that. After 27 years in the industry, you want to talk about more interesting things than that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's like that. It's just not tactical stuff. It's more strategic and setting of goals and visions. And yeah, that's great. It's like how to, I don't know, use responsive images gets old after a while, and it's done to death. So, but I love your point about the kinds of things you want to write about, and the kind, the area where your expertise lies is not SEO friendly. It's not things people are searching for. It's like solutions to problems that they don't even know they have, or they have if you bring it up, but they're not searching for it. It's not like a splinter or a gunshot wound. It's more like this creeping malaise, like, maybe I should quit freelancing and just go work for Google or something. It's like, what are they going to search for? Should I quit and go back, in-house?
That's exactly it. That often it's that people don't always realize what the underlying problem is. They know their symptom, but they don't know the cause.
Exactly.
And that can be that's a really complicated. Value-based pricing is a great example of it, actually. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are a group of people out there that are searching on value-based pricing, but they're the people that already know that they've got a need for that, right? It's all the people that don't know they've got a need for it and would never occur to them to search on that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do still, my blog these days, I every week I produce something. So one week it will be a newsletter, next week it'll be a blog post, and I alternate between them. And basically the blog posts these days are the SEO friendly stuff. They're the how-to kind of things to do it. Well, the newsletter is that deeper stuff. So
the bigger picture. You don't publish the emails on your website as well?
I do actually, but because of the way my blog post, as my website is formatted, they're not quite so prominent as the blog posts are.
I see. And so who's the ideal reader for the newsletter?
Oh, you see, now that would imply that I've got some kind of marketing strategy in place.
Well, I'm sure from who's on your list who it attracts.
so that was very facetious. I am a little bit more organized than that. I've got two basic audiences that I cater for, which are, and really my business is built around these. So we've got the in-house teams, which are typically, they're working for a relatively large organization, I don't know, Puma or British Petroleum or someone of that kind of size. And they're usually in a relatively small digital team, or they might call them a UX team or whatever else, and they feel quite isolated in that environment, and they're having trouble getting the rest of the organization to take user experience seriously, and they're struggling and that kind of thing. So I work a lot with people like that. So that's one half of my business. And but I also do, not dissimilar to you, I do a lot of mentorship for agency owners. So that would be my other group of people that I work with. So the newsletter, really, I mean, ideally I should have 2 separate newsletters, but I'm too lazy for that. And so there is one newsletter. Occasionally, it's amazing how many of the conversations are applicable to both audiences. A lot of the things I talk about do impact both audiences, but occasionally I will do different versions of a newsletter for those different audiences. And I've got them segmented. When you sign up, you say what you are, and so I do adapt it. But basically, it's those are the groups that I'm talking to.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. Do you think? Here's my opinion. You can tell me what you think. I think that someone who's out there as like a solo consultant, they're implying that they know what they're talking about. You can be self-deprecating as you want, but you still need to be perceived as an expert at a particular thing or the authority in the space for something. And I think that you can't go wrong. If that's the kind of business you've created for yourself, like solo or very small, where you're the principal. Maybe you've got a couple of helpers or something, or your wife's editing podcasts, but it's basically like one person. And if that's the kind of business that you have, I think you cannot go wrong writing and speaking on a regular basis. And that for me, that's it used to be flying around and speaking. That's the one time we actually met in person was in London at what was it? I don't even remember, WDX or some web thing. Yeah. And that was fine at the time, but even before pandemic era, it was like, it gets old, especially when you start having kids and dogs and so forth. So I was like, well, what am I going to do? So I stopped doing that when we had our second, and I was like, wow, what do you know? I'm not getting any leads anymore. I wonder if there's a connection. So that's right around the time I started getting serious about podcasting, even if it was kind of a hang out and have coffee with, Jonathan and Eric, that's my wife, with Jonathan and Kelly, talk about Rails or whatever. Yeah. And what do you know? Things started to pick back up. And so I think, but I see them differently. I see podcasting creating the intimacy, like, that sense that you're friends. And this is actually, you probably know this, we've probably talked about it. There's something called parasocial relationships that goes back as something that's been studied as far back as the 50s. And that's why celebrity endorsements work and so forth. Yeah. So it's real. Like, it definitely, and I know that it's happened to me. That was probably the example I was talking about in the email about you, because you were the first podcaster. I was just like, wow, this guy's famous, and I know everything about him, or you feel like you know everything about the person. Yeah. So that's one kind of trust. It's kind of irrational though, because as soon as you think about it too hard, it makes no sense. Yeah, but that's the way of the world. Right. We don't make decisions rationally, do we? Right. And then the writing, the regular writing, and I do daily writing, is which I do not know how the hell you do that. I'm telling you, it's easier. I swear to God, it's easier. I swear it is. I used to do weekly. It was much harder. It was much harder to do weekly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, is that because you're not self-editing? You're not getting caught up in yourself because you've just got to get something out. A little bit, but it's also that something happens when you're on deadline, so to speak. Yeah, that's true. Something happens. It flips a switch in your head where you start seeing ideas everywhere. That is true. No, I've experienced that. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. And so and I have a pretty relaxed schedule. So if I have an idea, I can just stop what I'm doing and write it. And I'm just like, oh, that would make a perfect email. And boom, 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 300 words later, send. And I have a couple of little tools that I set up for myself to make it trivially simple for me to just rip open a web page on my phone and type it in, hopefully there's not too many egregious typos or bad autocorrect, and just hit a couple buttons and it's published to my website and it goes out to, 10,000 people or whatever. Yeah. I just made it really easy so that, and doing it every day forces you to be like, oh, I really have to write some code to make this easier, because those little points of friction really start to add up. So there's a whole combination of things that cause it to be easier than weekly. I promise you it is easier. Anyway,
I don't believe. Yeah, I don't doubt you. It's just that impressed me when I realised it was daily. You don't do weekends, right? Please tell me you don't do weekends.
Every single day. I haven't missed a day in 6 years.
Flipping heck!
Yeah,
good man.
It's easy. I'm telling you, it's like my favorite. It's my favorite thing to do, like work-wise.
I've got to say, I agree with that. My newsletter, sitting down and writing my newsletter, is the one thing in my job that I enjoy more than anything else. So in some ways, there is a part of me that's quite tempted to do the same thing and go daily, but I don't think I ought to. I think I need to balance things. But there is a temptation, because oftentimes I get frustrated that I've got to wait another 2 weeks before I can send out another one, because there's something else knocking around in my head.
That was another thing that I found I loved about daily, was I didn't have to wait, or even just like pragmatically, I didn't have to like if I had something coming up that I was going to launch, and I missed my weekly thing, and I'm like, oh man, I was supposed to launch my new thing, and I sent a regular email, so now I have to email everybody on a Wednesday, but now I just email people every day.
Yeah, and it solves that problem.
It solves the problem, right? And after the PS, I just throw a couple of links in there. It's like, hey, buy my book, or hey, sign up for my course, and I don't even have to talk about it. So it's just in many, there's at least a half a dozen. I could probably come up with a dozen ways that it's way easier to do daily.
Yeah, it does sound
counterintuitive.
Good. You're tempting me. Stop tempting me.
I was dragged kicking and screaming by a friend who had made the switch and said, dude, you're going to love this. And I was like, no, how am I going to switch over? I've got all these campaigns running and blah. And he's like, just screw him up. He's not going to be smooth. And anyway, so we could talk about that offline.
Yeah.
But what I was saying was there's this sort of irrational parasocial relationship created by the speaking stuff, where people immediately know if they like you or click with you or don't click with you. And then there's the writing piece, which to me is where, at least I find, it's more of a rational appeal it's more of a rational trust. Like, wow, this person really can explain this. They're really turning on a light bulb. I'm really thinking new thoughts here. Like you said, it doesn't connect you with people the same way hearing them does. But I find that that's the place where I develop new ideas and insights in the writing. And then those are things I'll talk about later once I kind of have my head around how to talk about it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think there is another aspect that you do need to be... I see some common mistakes I see is, first, that you get people that really are writing... I'm very pragmatic, right? And I like to be very focused, right? So I'm beyond the point of doing any of this just because, Paul wants to be famous or I'm beyond that. I'm not criticizing people that are in that place, because I had a moment of that as well. But I want it to lead to more business ultimately. So I'm very pragmatic about it. First, a lot of people, I think, spend too much time writing for their peers rather than their clients, right?
Amen.
Which is a huge problem, I think. Secondly, all they're doing is throwing up, whether it be a blog post, whether it be a podcast or whatever, they're throwing it up on their own site, and nobody knows you exist and nobody reads it, right? And so it's very hard to keep momentum going in an environment like that when no one's really looking at it. So I actually construct it as a journey, right? Or you could say a sales funnel if you were particularly marketing focused. So, at the very top of that sits outreach things. What we're doing right now is me doing that. I approached you because you said something nice about me. You suggested that we did this interview. So I'm now currently reaching a new group of people that maybe haven't heard of me, right? So my hope from doing that is that will send some people to my newsletter, to my website. And on my website, my primary call to action is sign up to my newsletter. And then the newsletter is where I nurture that relationship, where, as you say, they get to know me a little bit through the videos that I produce, but they also get to see my expertise in action, right? This, like you say, this is where they hopefully people are going, that Paul, he's an okay man, instead of that Paul, he's a British arsehole. And that actually that then attracts them to my site. And then I get them signed up to the newsletter. And hopefully then they can intellectually see that I know my shit. Mm-hmm. And then after that, then hopefully they will hire me for something, whatever that thing is. And so it's a very structured journey of knowing that I need to get people's attention. I need to hold their attention. And I get people's attention through building some sense of relationship or connection. And I hold their attention by demonstrating value to them on an ongoing basis. I've now just totally given away my entire strategy that I want to convince people of that I'm trying to use on the people listening to this. All you need to do now is go to boagworld.com/subscribe and sign up for my newsletter.
Yes.
But, you get the idea.
Yeah. Well, transparency is very popular these days.
Yeah, let's call it that. Let's call it transparency. That sounds better.
So the reason why that would, whether or not you talk about it, the reason why it would work or not work completely hinges on whether or not people spend time and pay attention, spend and pay to your content, and then feel like they got a positive ROI from it. And I don't mean they instantly made $10 more than they would have billed, of course, but if every time I write one of these emails and I have an idea and I write it down, my sole goal is to make the reader glad they read it. Yeah,
you're entirely spot on.
Yeah. So and I just trust that if I can do that every day for like thousands of people, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. I don't need to worry about anything. So, but it comes down to that daily habit of making people glad they read that, glad they spent the time to pay attention. And it's well, if he can deliver positive ROI there, maybe I should buy his book. It's only $49.
Yeah.
So, and it's not like you're tricking anyone. Yes,
no.
I recognize that, I have a funnel. You recognize that you have a funnel. But it's I think educational content marketing, which is, I don't know if people still call it that or ever called it that, but I just see it as helping as many people as possible at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. That is all that it should be. And I think a lot of people, a lot of the agencies I mentor, and I'm sure it's the same with you, you talk to these founders and they go, well, I don't really like selling myself, or I don't really like marketing. And I say to them, well, don't do it. Just be a helpful, nice human being. That's all you ultimately need to do. And you do that by helping people out, by giving them, not holding anything back. And that's the thing, I think, where some marketing people fall down is they go, oh, well, I mustn't talk about that because that's my secret sauce that I sell. I talk about everything. I describe in immense detail how to do something like customer journey mapping, right? Yet customer journey mapping is the number one thing I get asked to do. And you think, well, that makes no sense, does it? I've just taught you step by step exactly how I do it. Why the hell are you then hiring me to do it? And it's because they're too busy, or they feel intimidated by it, or they just like the idea of working with me because they've come to like me. And it's okay, let's do this thing. I'm up for that. So I never hold anything back. And it really irritates me when people feel that they have to do that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I have a blog post from years ago called Share, 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 because I would get this question all the time. Well, I don't want to give away my best thinking. It's well, you're just going to be invisible.
Yeah.
Best...
It's that you could be the absolute genius of the web, but if nobody's ever heard of you, what's the point? I mean, it's I always, my daughter is a physicist, and she gets really annoyed that everyone loves, Stephen Hawking and Mitchell Kacker and people like that. or what's the Neil deGrasse Tyson? It's the other one. She despises that they get all of the publicity because, she knows of these physicists that nobody's ever heard of that are amazing and do incredible things and, all the rest of it. And it's like, well, that's the world we live in. You could be a genius, but if no one's heard of you, it's worth nothing.
Another way to put it is you could be a genius, but you're not helping anyone.
Yeah.
Right? So like
that's I like that. That's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, like Neil deGrasse Tyson is popularizing interest in physics, at least, or astronomy or whatever, and astrophysics. So it's like, is he the smartest guy out there? Probably not. There probably isn't a smartest guy or gal out there.
No.
Like who I mean, I understand your daughter's reaction is so common. I mean, you must have seen this. You probably were the target of this.
Oh, yeah.
Paul Boag's not that smart. I'm much smarter. And why isn't everyone hiring Headscape instead of us? And it's like, here's another one is, I get this all the time, where people are like, oh, sure, that works for you. You're famous. And I'm like, I wasn't born famous. Like, I used to be just like you. And then I wrote an email every day for 6 years. And now I'm not. Right. So it's not like, it's like they don't realize that it's not chicken or egg. It's like you need to start putting your best thinking out there. Why would you put not your best thinking out there?
Yeah.
Put it behind a paywall.
It is interesting, Mine, this thing of, well, that works for you, but it wouldn't work for me because I don't have your reputation. There is a degree, for me at least, of truth in that. The way that I built my reputation, I'm not sure would work in the same way anymore, right? Take podcasting, for example. Mm-hmm. I became well known for podcasting, not because I was doing amazing podcasts, but because there were no other podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, once people get to know you, they get to like you and they say subscribe to you. So I actually think just copying what we did wouldn't necessarily work anymore. You need to adapt for the reality that you're in. And in a much more constant, content saturated market, I do think that there is a degree of, okay, you need to be a little bit more strategic in this. I mean, me and Marcus just jumped on a mic and started talking absolute nonsense of whatever we cared about. I think you need to be more considered, and certainly more considered about who your audience is and who you're trying to reach, and to identify a niche that you are trying to reach these days, rather than doing something as general as we did, because otherwise you're just going to get lost in the noise of the internet. So there is a degree of truth in that. Just because it worked for us doesn't mean it's going to work for somebody else. But I do know what you're saying. You've got to put the work in.
Right. So let's. I want to re-say that with different language.
In a coherent way is what you're saying.
More like mapping it to things that I talk about regularly. So what Paul just said is exactly what I mean when I talk about. Niching down, which I do. We use the niche pronunciation here, and yes, and because it is easier. Just because it's easier to be different if you pick a specific type of listener or audience member or customer or client or whatever, because you can speak to them more directly, which will make you stand out, and you'll still attract other people. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I know you were trying to nicely summarize, but my chaotic style doesn't allow for that, so I have to talk all over you, right? But the other reason that I think you should niche down, that sounds really cool the way you say it, sounds so much better, is it's like I've got a tiny little pebble of marketing energy, right? I am a single person. And if I take that pebble and I throw it into the ocean of the internet, it's going to disappear without a trace. But if I take that pebble and throw it into a small pond of a particular niche, I can create ripples. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's the key. And what you want ideally is a niche where It's a community of people that already talk to one another. So I've done it, for example, in the higher education sector, where everybody who works in the higher education sector, they all just move around from one university to another, right? Mm-hmm. And so they take ideas and people and influencers from one location to another. And so you can become very dominant in a sector with a relatively small amount of effort because they just pass you around. Right? That doesn't happen if you don't niche. Oh, no,
right.
Sorry, niche down.
Right, or pigeonhole yourself is another thing I say.
Yeah.
But so I love the ocean that you brought up, the ocean metaphor, because when people use a fishing metaphor around this, they say, why would I fish with just a line, a hook and a line, instead of a big giant net?
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's the wrong metaphor. You're fishing with a line either in a barrel of fish or in the ocean.
Yeah.
It's not a net. Nike has a net.
Yeah.
Like Google has a net. They can spend massive marketing dollars and have massive sales force, but that you don't get being a generalist isn't a giant net. It's you in a dinghy in the middle of the ocean trying to catch one of 3.5 trillion fish. Maybe you'll have a good day, maybe you won't. But wouldn't you rather fish in a barrel that had, or a pool that had like 1,000 trout flopping out of it? It's like, yeah, of course. So okay, so back to the tactics thing. So copying tactics from 2005 is probably not going to work, like you said. Doing exactly what you did, just two guys in a room talking about random web stuff, probably is not going to work. But if you copy the strategy, which is help as many people for free at scale as you can, that strategy will work.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So but the tactics might be, now you got to go on TikTok to do it, or Instagram stories, or it doesn't matter. Like that doesn't matter. But if you find the place where your fish are all hanging around, whether it's TikTok or Reddit or LinkedIn groups or an IRC or Slack or wherever they are, go there and be helpful. And they might click on the link in your profile and go find out more about you.
Can I give a real example of that?
Please.
Something that I did. So I mentioned higher education a minute ago. So we won our first higher education client. I can't remember. I won't bother with the years, but a long time ago. And it was a university, and we loved working with it, and we got really quite excited about the sector. We thought it was interesting. There was a lot to do. So with that particular client, I said to him, look, whether you guys talk to one another, what books do you read, what forums do you go to, what do you, conferences, that kind of stuff. And he was like, well, I don't really know. There is this mailing list I'm on called the IWMW mailing list. The what? The Institutional Web Managers Workshop mailing list. The most boring sounding thing ever. So I then tried to join it, and I couldn't because I didn't have the UK equivalent of a .edu domain name, right? So I wrote to the guy who ran it, and he said very politely, go away, we don't let commercial people on it. And I said, well, look, I'm just looking to learn about the sector. I don't want to sell. I don't want to talk about my services. I'm just trying to understand the sector better. And he said, well, you can join it if you don't post, right? And you think, well, what's the point of doing that? So, but I did it anyway because I did want to learn about the sector and understand it better, because I was talking about niching down to that sector. So I joined it and sat on there, and it wasn't long before somebody posted something that I thought I could help with. So I wrote out an email offering advice, and help on that issue, and I sent it to the guy who ran the list. And he said, yeah, that's fine, go ahead and post it. So I did. And then that happened again. And again, and I kept offering advice, and I kept sending it to the guy who ran the list, and he kept saying, yeah, that's fine. So in the end, he said, look, just stop annoying me, right? You can post it as long as you don't sell. So that's all I did on the list, was give good advice. And now eventually I discovered they also do a conference once a year, right? And I said, can I speak at the conference? And he said, no, because you're a commercial person, but you can come. So I went to the conference, and I just hang out with everybody. I gave a bit of advice. I bought them alcohol, just took part and built a reputation. Everybody liked me, and, that kind of stuff. So the next year I said, can I speak at the event? And he said, all right then, as long as you don't sell. So I went along and I spoke at the event, and I didn't sell, and I didn't do it. And I ended up keynoting that every year for about 10 years. Right?
Wow.
Because they came to like my content. I never once pushed my services. I didn't need to. They came to me. It was the way you push your service is by showing your expertise. Show, don't tell.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. I'm so glad that went so far up. Like when that was like a full rags to riches, like success story of the way to do marketing.
Yeah. And we've done that. I've done that more than once. I did that in the heritage sector as well. And we got into a heritage sector. So that would be things like the National Trust. So areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, old buildings, all of that kind of stuff, right?
Got it, yep.
And we did it. It actually became problematic in that situation. We won something like 80 to 90% of every area of outstanding natural beauty in the country. We won everything. So it got to the point where people weren't hiring us simply because, we can't hire Headscape, everybody hires them. So that's when we moved on to HE, because it was like, well, we've saturated the market. I don't know how to go any further here. So, and I've done it again in other sectors as well.
That's great. I had a similar story. It didn't go to, I gave up on it for a variety of reasons that don't matter, but same kind of thing. I had a couple of clients in the credit union space, and I was like, these folks are actually fun. They're like the hippies of banking. I dig them. But they're just not online. They're just not the kind of people that are they're online. Some of the younger ones, but credit union presidents were not hanging out on Facebook. So same thing. I asked around. Turned out there was a listserv of 250 credit union presidents, all asking basically saying, I need help with this. Do you know anybody? How do you guys deal with this regulation? Yeah. And I didn't say anything, but I'm like reading it, and it was fascinating to me because it was almost like I was reading their inner thoughts. So then when I would talk to someone, I would be so up to date with what was going through their mind that I could almost read it. Yeah. It was, and I didn't end up keynoting. Well, actually I did end up getting speaking gigs, not directly from the list, but anyway, I ended up stopping that business like in the middle of that experiment. But it was just like a dopey old listserv, ugly, like huge, massive email chain, but just amazing, like, painstorming, Amy Hoy would call it. It's just like, you just like getting their innermost, like nightmares and worries and fears and dreams and hopes and all of this emotionally charged kind of stuff that you want to help with.
And that's why I like niching around an audience rather than around a deliverable. A lot of people, when they niche, they niche to a particular deliverable. I'm going to do Ruby on Rails or whatever, right? And that's their thing. And that does work to a degree, depending on what the deliverable is, because, obviously there are a lot of Rails communities and that kind of stuff. But there is something about niching to a sector where that group of people are talking and sharing and interacting with one another. Some sectors don't work because they're highly competitive.
Yeah, plastic surgery.
So they don't talk to one another. And then you've got a problem because you don't get that kind of echo chamber effect. But if you find a sector where they do, boy, does the possibilities are endless, because you get to see and understand their pain points and their goals, and you get also the word of mouth recommendation around the sector as well. Yeah,
it's amazing. So we could probably talk for 4 hours, but it's not that kind of show.
Yeah, we've been going for over an hour already, haven't we?
No way. Oh, yeah, you're right. Holy mackerel. Yeah, so I should let you go. I'm probably late for a meeting or something. I thought we would. But cool. This has been absolutely fabulous. We should keep in touch more regularly than once every 5 years.
Yeah, it does happen, doesn't it?
Yes, time flies. So tell people one more time where they should go to find out more about all things Paul Boag.
So if you want to enter the Boag funnel, you can go to boagworld.com, BOAG world.com. If you want to sign up to the newsletter, which, to be honest, I have a look around the website, see if you like the content. But really, if you want to follow me on any kind of long-term stuff, then the newsletter is the way to go. That's boagworld.com/subscribe. Hopefully you won't miss the massive call to action that I have plastered all over my website. But if you do, that's the URL you want. You can also follow me on Twitter if you're so inclined. I'm not very good on Twitter these days. I got so much abuse, I've kind of given up on it. But that's Boag World. So, yeah, have a look, see what you think, and maybe give me a follow.
Yeah, definitely check it out. Great stuff. Always great stuff. Love it. All right, Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, that's it for this week. I'm Jonathan Stark, and you can join me again next time on Ditching Hourly. Bye now.